Thank you, first of all, for joining us on what is our first presentation of the year in our Diversity and Justice Speaker Series. And so for those of you who are just joining us for the first time, the Diversity and Justice Speaker Series, or DJSS, is hosted by the Criminology Law and Society Department, and it features established academics whose work addresses diversity and justice in kind of the broadest sense of those words. Over the winter and the spring quarter, we'll have 3 additional speakers joining us, so keep your eyes out for the emails, and I hope you can join us for those talks too. Today, though, I am very honored to introduce our first speaker of the year, Dr. Michael Ralph. Dr. Ralph is an associate professor in the Department of Social and Cultural Analysis at New York University. He holds a joint appointment, if I got that right, a joint appointment with the School of Medicine, and serves as the director of Africana Studies at NYU. So while his training is in anthropology, he received his PhD in anthropology, his research is impressively interdisciplinary and integrates political science, economics, history, and medical anthropology to critique and examine topics such as debt, slavery, insurance, forensics, and incarceration, topics that I think are of broad interest to many of you here. His research has resulted in numerous articles, far too many to list, as well as a solo authored book, this one published by the University of Chicago Press in 2015, Forensics of Capital, which draws from his fieldwork in Senegal and explores the intersections of debt and social standing through an analytic of forensics. And more recently, and I think he's just returned from, fieldwork in Eritrea, and he's also undertaken 2 larger book manuscript projects that center on slavery, insurance, and incarceration. And I believe we'll be hearing about that segment of his research today. There's, of course, much, much more that could be said about Dr. Ralph's many accomplishments. And he's got this fantastic website, michaelralph.org, which really highlights some of kind of his very, very creative approaches to some difficult topics. And some of the kind of approaches that he takes, which really intrigue me, are a children's musical and a graphic novel, and wrestling with topics like debt and slavery. So I think it would be really exciting to learn more about those. But anyways, I don't want to delay what promises to be an exciting and informative talk. So please help me in warmly welcoming Dr. Michael Ralph, who will be presenting his paper entitled Before 13, The Origin of Convict Leasing.
So thank you, Leah. I hope I can do justice to a very generous introduction. Thank you all for coming here. I want to apologize in advance. I guess people tell me that I tend to mumble and that I tend to speak softly and that I tend to speak fast. So, a friend actually told me that while I was doing fieldwork in Senegal after I came back, she said that while I was gone, she forgot how to speak my language. So if I'm like mumbling or speaking softly, let me know. I'll try to speak more loudly, more clearly. So it's an honor to be here. It's very exciting. I know some of the faculty here, some of my close friends and colleagues I admire teach here, and I've met grad students today who are very impressive. So I want to talk a little bit about some of my different projects before turning to some of my most recent research. And as Lee mentioned, Forensics of Capital is a book I published a few years ago, and it began with some very basic anthropological questions. I guess the 2 main questions were like, how do people decide who is authorized to conduct trade on their behalf? How do people decide who is authorized to forge diplomatic agreements on their behalf? And I think beginning with these questions helped me to avoid some common assumptions about who wields political influence. And in tracing the formation of sovereignty in Senegal, I show that colonialism did not merely proceed through conquest, but involved an elaborate series of negotiations with the rulers of regional kingdoms, as well as women who had children by European traders, and thus gained access to land and capital that they shared with the men in their family, cousins, siblings, children, channeling wealth to free people of color in the region. I also show how Islamic marabouts and indigenous groups who maintained ritual traditions strategically harnessed other kinds of political influence and access to different kinds of resources. So in the process, I basically argue that in the way that it shapes social standing and access to capital, the diplomatic profile of any country is a forensic profile as well as a credit profile. And I think the same could be said for individual people, that even the social networking profile at some level is a proxy for your forensic profile or your credit profile. So much so that if a person is accused of a crime, often the first thing law enforcement officials would do is see where and how someone's credit card is being used, or see what kinds of illicit activity might have been occurring on the person's social media platform or something like that. So I explore some of these dynamics in at least one of the book projects that I'm working on at the moment. And I guess the first one I want to sort of mention is a picture book called Fishing. Oh, sorry. Fishing is a practice. It takes its name from the way that incarcerated people will sometimes tear up bed sheets to make strings that they tie to objects to share with each other. A different project that I've been working on is about sort of bringing together some articles I've been writing over the past decade into book chapters and incorporating some new material. And that project is tentatively entitled F is for Forensics. The title is actually taken from a quote by the rapper Lil Wayne, who in various songs refers to himself as Wheezy F. And he's used the F for more than 30 references, including FEMA, franchise, fashion, and my favorite, phenomenal. Jay-Z is fond of saying that he was born the same day that Fred Hampton died, the day the late Black Panther leader was murdered in his sleep. And Jay-Z would have us believe that this connection radicalized him. But instead, I'm interested to think about how a generation that political scientists have dubbed the post-civil rights generation and hip-hop generation has developed theoretical ruminations on crime, surveillance, profiling, race, inheritance, family credit, the state, loss, longing. A theory, in other words, of forensics. My project aims to shift the analytic focus from the authenticity some rappers claim or the harms that some critics are concerned with to the intellectual and artistic merit of the arguments that some of hip-hop's most influential lyricists develop about forensics in their work. At the moment, as Lee said, I'm conducting ethnographic research in Eritrea that shares some of the conceptual focus as the work on hip-hop, though it was born from a different kind of interest. And I was sort of intrigued by exploring an ethnographic context, especially one in Africa that was rather different from Senegal, where I've done work before. So Senegal is a Muslim country that supported the US-led war on terror. It's a socialist country that opposed Cuban and Soviet involvement in African liberation struggles. In other words, Senegal's status as a leader of economic and political reform in Africa is very much tied to helping to promote a kind of liberal consensus, the consensus of sort of affluent nations about the kind of political and economic trajectory that African countries should pursue. And Eritrea, by contrast, has been dubbed a terrorist watch list nation, a rogue state, et cetera. It's routinely spurned World Bank and UN policy recommendations, and yet is one of Africa's fastest growing economies. Eritrea's complicated diplomatic standing derives from the misfortune of being an African country colonized by its neighbor Ethiopia, a country that ironically bears the distinction of being the only African country never to be colonized. So my current ethnographic project is explicitly concerned with what you could call martyr certificates. These are commendations that the state prepares for the families of veterans who died during more than 3 decades of warfare with Ethiopia in order to secure and defend independence. I'm interested in the clinical practices and vernacular strategies that Eritrean medical experts and soldiers use to conduct forensic analysis and to develop scientific explanations for cause of death. These narratives were eventually used to create these documents the government issues, and in the process, Eritreans developed ad hoc scientific procedures for medical analysis. But these martyr certificates, for me, they're not just sort of forensic documents, but they're sort of honorifics. Eritreans often frame and hang them in their homes in lieu of the photos of deceased loved ones. So I'm really interested in how these sort of documents help to create a sense of shared political belonging. And it's very intriguing to me that Eritrea declared independence in '91. They held a referendum in '93 where 99% of the population agreed to affirm their sovereignty, but in the intervening year, they issued these martyr certificates. So it was as if it was important to the state to secure a sense of political belonging from its own populace even before it was recognized on the world stage as a sovereign nation. Today, the research I'll be sharing grew out of some ethnographic and conceptual questions that lingered after I completed Forensics of Capital. And noticing that a lot of young people in Senegal were trying to escape like a 50% unemployment crisis, and we're using sports, increasingly basketball, to leave the country. I got really interested in how like coaches and recruiters decided how much an athlete's skill set or athlete's life is worth. And I started exploring scholarship on slavery, actuarial science, life insurance, basically any kind of protocol for assessing the monetary value of a person's skill set or evaluating a person's life. And I noticed that historians of life insurance treated slave insurance as separate and distinct from life insurance. For them, slaves were property, so slave insurance was no different than insuring furniture or something like that. But when you look at how the industry emerged, you notice that slave insurance didn't really become big until after 1808. And that was because when the slave trade to the U.S. was outlawed in 1808, so even though slavery was still legal, people could no longer import them from overseas. And so much of slavery then became about how to move slaves around within the U.S. or breeding them. And so people who owned slaves in abundance no longer were as interested in trying to sell them because they wanted to be able to recover the value of their enslaved property, so they would like rent them out. So as they rented these enslaved people out to corporations or to other people, they would often insure them in case they died or were injured while they were in someone else's possession. So slave insurance sort of became big after 1808 until 1865. And the other thing that's interesting and important about slave insurance is that slaves who worked on cotton plantations, sort of picking cotton, were never insured as far as I can tell. Instead, insured slaves were usually artisans like blacksmiths or cobblers. They worked in lucrative and very dangerous industries like railroads or steamboats, or they were bureaucrats like maids, butlers, clerks, and drivers. So some years ago, I was a fellow in the Charles Warren Center at Harvard, and I was sort of creating a multimedia project, and I started working on something that has since become, I guess, the world's most comprehensive ledger of insured slaves, Treasury of Weary Souls. And you can just find it at treasuryofwearysouls.com. And the coding for this project was done by a Boston area group, Resilient Coders, which trains people who are formerly incarcerated, young people, and also who are in juvenile prepares them for jobs in the tech sector. And basically they did the coding based on the data I collected. And the site lets you look at slave insurance records in two ways. You can either look at it based on the industry breakdown. So like there's a kind of color-coded chart at the bottom that, like in this case, this enslaved person worked as a blacksmith. The owner was H.M. Wheat. The enslaved person's name was Harry. He worked in Alabama. The records were housed in the Baltimore Life Insurance Company archive. And the map just shows you like where the geographic distribution of the industries. And then, or you can look by insurer. So in this case, that bar graph at the bottom shows you essentially which insurance companies inherited the value of these policies. So the Baltimore Life Insurance Company actually was defunct by the time slavery was abolished. So, but the rest of the companies, AIG, Aetna, New York Life Insurance, it doesn't mean that these companies acquired all those policies in the antebellum period. Oftentimes, they purchased companies that once housed these policies, and or it could have been the earlier corporate form of these insurance companies that owned some of these policies. So sometimes the companies would try to distance themselves from this record of trafficking in slave insurance policies by saying that technically they were a different company when that happened, or something like that, or that they acquired companies that had these policies, but they weren't the ones that took out these policies. But my question is always like, well, if they want to distance themselves from this industry, did they give the money back? You know, like, so the contemporary value of the policies they would have inherited, that would be my question. But so the research I want to talk about today, though, actually came about when I was building this site, because when I was researching the enslaved people who were insured in Kentucky, I noticed that the occupation of the enslaved people was not listed. So I was interested in like what enslaved people would have been doing in Kentucky. And so I started doing some archival research, and I found a memo in the state archives in Kentucky where the prison warden was writing to the governor saying that he didn't want to produce hemp in the prison anymore, even though it had been the biggest source of revenue for 3 decades. And I had read about, as I was doing the research on slavery in Kentucky, I had noticed that enslaved people were used to farm hemp, but I had never seen any connection to a prison, so I was interested in this connection. And then sort of what I discovered in the course of that led me to rethink the sort of widespread emphasis on the 13th Amendment as the origin of convict leasing, or sort of the origin of private prison labor or something like that, because this memo was dated like 1860 basically. So if hemp had been the biggest source of revenue for 3 decades in the prison, it's an interesting story about how something that was chiefly or exclusively almost associated with slave labor in Kentucky was imported into the prison. So I'll talk about that today. But basically, you could think of this as being a conversation with Ava DuVernay's critically acclaimed film 13th. I think of this project maybe as like a prequel to that or something like that, a friendly amendment. I don't have the budget for my own documentary, so I was gonna do like a graphic book version. So this is like the first page of the graphic book version. And it's narrated by Frederick Douglass, who plays a role in the story, as I'll tell. But you know, U.S. President Abraham Lincoln once said, in referring to the state where he was born, that I think to lose Kentucky is nearly the same as to lose the whole game. And in my talk today, I want to argue that convict leasing took root in Kentucky because of its unique relationship to 3 related developments. One is the plight of debtors in the aftermath of the American Revolution. The second factor is the birth of the domestic slave trade that I referenced. And the third is the debut of incarceration as a increasingly pervasive mode of punishment. The framers of the U.S. Constitution, concerned by legislation that was favoring the plight of debtors, drafted a document that would embolden the federal government to levy taxes and tighten the monetary supply to enhance the financial position of creditors. Meanwhile, you know, the westward march of slavery prepared Kentucky to launch a hemp industry that was uniquely profitable. In the story I'll tell, the desperate plight of debtors in the context of booming hemp profits made them especially vulnerable to a man named Joel Scott's innovative model for extracting profit from prison labor based on techniques enslaved African workers had developed for transforming a stubborn plant into an economic marvel, as a discourse emerged about the eccentricity of the Negro. In the process, new protocols for debt emerged in tandem with a new geography of enslavement that facilitated a new mode of criminal justice. All right. So the Revolutionary War freed Americans from British laws restricting movement. So many people headed west after the American Revolution that whenever merchants in Kentucky could not recover their debts and cannot figure out what happened to the debtors who were supposed to pay them back, they would sometimes just mark in their account books, "Gone to Kentucky." And these dynamics help to explain why U.S. Senator Colonel Richard M. Johnson's 1823 speech on a proposition to abolish imprisonment for debt was greeted with so much enthusiasm. Given that he and his compatriots had just waged war against Britain for trying to turn American colonists into slaves, Johnson insisted that wealthy creditors do not have the power to deprive the citizen of his freedom. Thus, as the esteemed historian Bruce Mann has noted, in Kentucky and wherever else they migrated, debtors did not live as outlaws. They settled towns, opened stores, carved farms out of the wilderness, built plantations, bought slaves, traded, voted, socialized, worshipped, married, reared children, and died. Still, they lived outside the practical reach of all but the most determined creditors, he notes, which created a problem for the kind of society the framers of the U.S. Constitution had envisioned, one in which they could carve out unprecedented profits through new opportunities to access commercial credit. The Federalists, who fought with determination to have the Constitution ratified, considered Article 1, Section 10 to be the most significant provision, since it focused on laws regulating contracts and debts. Not all of the architects of the Constitution were wealthy, but they were all determined to make the U.S. safe for capital investment. So Kentucky was a battlefield between debtors and creditors. Some people felt that the banks were not doing enough to provide relief for a populace starved of capital. Other people felt like the banks were too lenient and worried about inflation. Henry Clay, the Kentucky senator known far and wide for his persuasive oratory, entered the fray to resolve these dynamics. At an 1820 meeting for the stockholders in the Bank of Kentucky, he gave a passionate 3-hour speech calling for a new bank charter that would provide security against the evil of relief for debtors. Clay was gifted at using empathy for the oppressed to enhance structures of privilege. In part because of his efforts, creditors eventually got the upper hand over debtors. Within 5 years, the same dynamics that made Kentucky a haven for debtors in pursuit of unprecedented freedom created the conditions for novel experiments in incarceration. Excuse me. So besides being a haven for debtors, Kentucky extended suffrage to African Americans soon after the state was founded in 1792. It was one of the first states to discuss abolishing slavery. These are just some of the reasons that Daniel Boone referred to Kentucky as a second paradise. Kentucky began as a diaspora of Virginia as people moved west. It also borrowed its first criminal code from its home state. Progressive legislators maintained that while crimes like murder or treason should be punished by death, confinement at hard labor would foster repentance and thus serve as a greater deterrent to crime than hanging. Kentucky settler colonizers were inspired by the stance native son Thomas Jefferson developed after dedicating himself to the legal reasoning of the 18th century Italian scholar Cesare Beccaria, who argued that in an enlightened society it was crucial to make punishment proportionate to crime. Jefferson had also spent time touring France, where he was inspired by the increasing use of imprisonment as a substitute to capital punishment for serious crimes. He was initially unable to convince Virginia legislators to implement these reforms. Yet, following Jefferson's lead, Kentucky developed the most humane laws yet known to the colonies. Indispensable to their new philosophy of reform, Kentucky legislators decided to build the state penitentiary before there was even anyone to incarcerate. Later that year, John Turner was convicted of stealing someone's horse, a crime that would have been punishable by death 6 months prior. This being his first offense, Turner was sentenced to the penitentiary for 2 years, becoming Kentucky's first convict. Anne M. Walbot did a 2-year bid that began in 1802, though it would be more than 40 years before separate quarters were established for women. At one point, there were more than 900 men and just 40 women in the Kentucky penitentiary. The facility was run by a keeper who managed it, an agent who kept the books, and a council of inspectors composed of influential citizens appointed by the governor who made regular visits, prepared reports, and advised legislators. The prisoners, quote, were to be kept at hard labor according to age, sex, and ability to work, end quote. So inmates were assigned to a range of artisanal enterprises, including blacksmithing, cobbling, being cobblers, making shoes, nail making, stone cutting, and spinning. Usually what a person did on the outside before coming to the prison determined the work assignment they would get inside. But elected officials and members of the prison review committee soon began to complain that the division of labor was ill-conceived and haphazard, as evident in an 1817 report prepared by a prison inspector, Mr. Rudd. The rooms appropriated to carry on some of the branches of the profession are too small for the number of hands employed therein, which prevents their doing business expeditiously. Elected officials likewise thought the Kentucky penitentiary had no discernible purpose, failed to reform inmates, and struggled to break even, much less turn a profit. That is, until the watershed regime of Joel Scott, the wealthy textile manufacturer who assumed the duties of keeper in 1825. Scott immediately ordered uniforms for all of the inmates. They wore a shirt, overalls, and a hip-length hunting shirt made from hemp. Claiming the prison yard was encumbered with filth of all kinds, he established new standards for cleanliness. Scott made extensive renovations, down to sketches of the machinery, in the course of making prison labor less like a series of artisanal workshops and much more like a factory that specialized in a few select industries. Scott's ambitious plan to transform the appearance and labor structure of the prison articulated with a new vision for liberal reform that surfaces in a report Governor Joseph Dacia issued to the Kentucky legislature 2 years into Scott's tenure as keeper. Much labor-saving machinery has been constructed and new branches of manufacturing introduced, which promises to be highly advantageous and gives this institution the appearance of a busy and extensive manufacturing establishment rather than a place of punishment. The convicts themselves, though constantly at labor at all proper hours, seem as contented as men could be in such a situation. Much pains have also been taken to inculcate upon them moral and religious principles, but I regret to say that these efforts have been attended with little success. The frequent and speedy return of convicts under sentence for new crimes, committed almost in the first moments of their release, admonish us that we must not be too sanguine in looking to our own penitentiary as a means of reformation. Anticipating critics of his emphasis on prison industry, Governor Dacia stressed the social benefits of longer sentences under Scott's new work regimen. Instances are known in which convicts have formed associations with the penitentiary to plunder and rob as soon as they get out. And without further legislation, they may constitute a kind of banditry which would be dangerous to society. Would it not be better for the state and safer for people in cases whose repeated convictions for high crimes have proved the utter hopelessness of reformation, so to change the law as to confine these incorrigible offenders for very long terms or for life? Governor Dacian would ultimately argue that longer prison sentences even benefited former inmates in the long run. They might then be made to support themselves instead of living upon the plunder of honest citizens, and by their earnings render to society some slight compensation for the evils they may have inflicted. Scott built an organizational culture that was consistent with the latest in prison science, combining Eastern Penitentiary in Pennsylvania's famous techniques for keeping inmates separate with Auburn Prison in New York's focus on silence. Dr. William Sneed, who offered a report on the prison, helps clarify what that looked like. When the first bell rang at daybreak, the convicts got up, dressed, made their beds, and swept their cells. At the second bell, the assistant keeper and a guard unlocked the doors. The prisoners left their cells, formed a single line, and marched silently to their workshops. When anyone wanted something, he rang a bell, which summoned a waiter who kept the workers supplied with material. When the bell rang, when the bell rang for meals, the men formed a single file in silence and marched to the dining room. To obtain additional bread, the convict raised his hand. But the key to Scott's operation was the elaborate infrastructure he created for producing hemp, as he explains during an annual report in 1829. I have made extensive and valuable improvements in the establishment. I have built a shed 84 yards long for the manufacture of bagging used to hold cotton in the plantation south, and have in operation 4 bagging looms, and have also erected a hemp house within the walls. The improvements have enabled me to introduce into the institution the following rules and regulations, as the economy of the establishment and its prison discipline are subjects of the most interesting concern to the legislature and to the community. Scott's dual mandate concerned the economy of the establishment and prison discipline, even if he was not clear about how these aims would achieve the lofty goal of progressive reform that justified building the prison in the first place. Within a decade, 2/3 of the inmates were working in hemp, and it had become the penitentiary's chief source of revenue, the byproduct of Scott's deliberate decision to have inmates farm a crop that enslaved people had historically worked almost exclusively. Elijah Craig is the mythical founder of Kentucky bourbon. But settler colonizers were producing this prized spirit years before he arrived. But Craig did have the first printing press in Kentucky. He also installed the state's first rope walk used to process hemp. Even before the Revolutionary War had concluded, Virginia Governor Lord Dunmore was recruiting for mounted rangers he could enlist to decimate indigenous people and seize their land. These militias on horseback, whom the Shawnees dubbed Long Knives, pioneered a method of warfare that targeted food supplies and civilians, including grisly acts of intimidation, in the service of clearing land that settlers took advantage of in their push west. Within years of moving to Kentucky, residents began to farm and cultivate hemp near their forts and cabins. The plant was attractive because, in the view of one bluegrass expert, hemp exhausts the soil slowly, if at all. The main reason hemp was so popular in Kentucky is that it could be used to make a wide range of household goods. In the absence of cotton plantations, hemp could be used to make clothing. Hemp was used to make baskets, as well as rope, which had a number of important functions. Due to hemp's durability, it was used to make sails that were exported to the U.S. Navy. So while hemp was not a major crop for the American colonies or states as a whole, it was pivotal to the Kentucky economy. According to the foremost authority on the subject, without hemp, slavery might not have flourished in Kentucky, since other agricultural products of the state were not conducive to the extensive use of bondsmen. And since hemp does not require as much attention as must be given to cotton, the number of Negroes on a Kentucky farm was usually far less than the number necessary on a cotton plantation of comparable size. Thus, while Henry Clay preferred the dispassionate language of an orator and elected official when discussing slavery, the stakes were more compelling and more urgent. Frederick Douglass made the North Star, the newspaper he had founded, the occasion for an 1847 letter to Henry Clay. Douglass addressed the famed orator and elected official who had given a speech the month prior concerning his position on what he called the great evil of slavery. Abraham Lincoln gave the eulogy at Henry Clay's funeral, and Clay is widely credited with giving Lincoln his pragmatic stance on slavery, that while it could not be defended on moral grounds, it was essential to preserving the Union and should eventually be abolished. Douglass shifts the terrain of this argument. Excuse me. He highlights the fact that Henry Clay has a material investment in slavery. As Douglass said to Clay bluntly, "You are yourself at this moment a slaveholder." Douglass's point, in other words, is that Clay's position on slavery is not a clever rhetorical strategy. It is an investment strategy designed by someone who cannot defend slavery on moral grounds, but is still making money from it. Soon after he arrived in Kentucky from Virginia, Henry Clay acquired partial ownership of a hemp factory. As such, his sources of revenue would include products made from hemp, like boat sails and rope. Formerly enslaved persons like Dan Bogey from Madison County's Wheeler Plantation and Aunt Harriet Mason from the Jones Plantation in Guard County recount long histories of intimacy with hemp. As in the story Burt Mayfield, enslaved at the Stone Plantation south of Bryanteville, makes when discussing an annual ritual of being outfitted with new clothes. On Christmas, each of us stood in line to get our clothes. We were measured with a string which was made by a cobbler. The material had been woven by the slaves in the plantation shop. The flax and hemp were raised on the plantation. As such, enslaved workers skilled in farming hemp were highly coveted. An 1827 Kentucky reporter advertisement boasting about Negroes for sale took care to mention a Negro man who was a first-rate hemp hackler. Hemp farming had become so intricate in 19th century Kentucky that enslaved farmers were sometimes roped together in precise intervals to make sure they distributed the hemp seed evenly. After about 120 days, hemp was cultivated using one of two methods. In a process called dew-rotting, the hemp was cut and spread on the ground for several months so that rain, snow, and dew could bleed the plant of its cherished resin Excuse me, and help bind the fiber to the woody part of the stalk. Water rotting involved fixing the hemp plant in a still body of water, usually a large pond. After several months, the plant was strained and spread on the ground to dry, then subjected to a handbrake. Water rotting produced a hemp plant of greater softness and durability, but Kentucky farmers favored dew rotting, the least expensive and most straightforward method. Once rotted, the hemp plant was dried and stacked. Next, the lint would be separated from the wood through a process that involved breaking the stalks. Then farmers would hackle the hemp stalk to extract fibers. And here's a picture of like what a handbrake looks like. During the decades that hemp was a profitable crop, there were several attempts to introduce machinery and streamline the process. Yet by the time the age of hemp was drawing to a close, the industry had reached a consensus about the demographic that had mastered the crop. As noted in an 1859 Kentucky Farmer article, quite a variety of machinery has been tried for hemp breaking, together with Dutch, Irish, and natives, but a stout Negro man with a good handbrake, a fair task before him, and prompt pay for his overwork now has a decided preference, if not a complete monopoly. Breaking and cleaning by horsepower machinery is a possible achievement, but would hardly be profitable. In 1836, a resident of Lexington, Kentucky, explained the pervasive role of bonded labor by insisting that hemp farming was so laborious that scarcely any white man will work at it. Hemp was a stubborn plant whose fibers were notoriously difficult to extract. Hemp farming was, as one observer put it, a very dirty process. Laborious and unpleasant, hemp farming was reserved for slave labor. As William C. Bullitt, a participant in the 1859 to 1860 Kentucky Constitutional Convention, insisted, the free states do not and will not raise hemp and tobacco. After emancipation, the task fell to Negro tenant farmers. Burt Mayfield carefully explains the diverse age groups involved in the elaborate task of producing clothes from hemp. The younger slaves had to swingle it with a wooden instrument, somewhat like a sword, about 2 feet long. The hemp was hackled by the older slaves. The hackle was an instrument made of iron teeth, about 4 inches long. The hemp stalks were laid on these benches, and hackled herds were then pulled through the machine. This recollection underscores the fact that, as one observer put it, enslaved men had a monopoly on all tasks connected with hemp farming, as well as the expertise even used to make clothing from it. But this was all part of the way that expertise in hemp farming had acquired a distinct racial and gendered quality, evident in the open letter H. Blanton wrote to the American farmer 3 years later, in which he gushed, "None but our strong Negro men can handle hemp to advantage." With like praise, another Kentucky agriculturalist declared, as long as hemp was produced in the state, at least certain types of work, such as breaking the stalks, were largely reserved for the Negro. Over time, Kentucky farmers came to believe that this extraordinary expertise was made possible by a special affinity for the crop. As the 1926 New York Times article remarked, Kentuckians sometimes referred to hemp as an end crop, owing to a belief that no one understood its eccentricities as well or was as expert in handling it as the Negro. The idea that Negroes possessed unique expertise with hemp was a compliment masquerading as an insult. Kentucky farmers marveled at Negro ingenuity, at the fact that enslaved workers outperformed horses or any sort of technology they had managed to develop. Observers noticed that the prototypical inmate was likely to be a Kentucky-born Negro boy from Jefferson County who was less than 21 years of age with no better than an 8th grade education, Jefferson County being the leading county in hemp production for free farmers. Ultimately, farmers would be the most prominent laborers amongst prison inmates. Despite widespread appreciation for Negro mastery, hemp had never been the basis for major capital investment or part of a concerted industrial project until the watershed regime of Joel Scott. In this early stage of the history of the penitentiary, an inspector named in the record simply as Mr. Blair had inquired whether farming hemp might be a viable industry for inmates. I have thought that the spinning of hemp ropes and twine and eventually thread fine enough for coarse linen might be so learnt that the preparation of hemp would afford some employment and that the procuring of implements and materials would be attended with but an inconsiderable expense. Yet Blair received disappointing news in preliminary conversations with regional experts. The conductor of the rope manufactory near this town is, however, of the opinion that the spinning of hemp is an employment which cannot be beneficially taken up by persons arrived at years of maturity. In other words, extracting fibers from such a stubborn plant favors workers who have spent their entire lives perfecting the task, bonded workers. As such, Blair had tried to research this option in a place where hemp and slaves were aplenty. I had hoped to have been able to obtain further information on this subject at Lexington, especially if I could have met with some person there. This, however, has not been in my power. The origin of a convict lease system using hemp would have to wait until Joel Scott's family made the trek from Virginia, like the families of Henry Clay, Elijah Craig, and countless others, who often brought enslaved people with them. In the words of one observer, the closest Kentucky ever got to a southern plantation was the large bluegrass farm upon which hemp was one of the major crops and where virtually all manual labor was performed by slaves. But extended prison sentences made working with hemp a lot more like the conditions of slavery than the brief sentences that had initially been handed out. As hemp became profitable, it became more pervasive in the prison. At its height, 2/3 of the inmates were working in hemp. And as the profits increased, the prison became more coercive. The death rate in the prison spiked with the rise of hemp. Between December 1st, 1857 and February 28th, 1859, prison resistance took a ghastly form when 3 inmates each cut off a hand to avoid the bagging loom where they spun hemp. Inmates also tried to burn the hemp ash down to avoid its alarming rates of respiratory illness and escalating death toll. In other moments, inmates refused to leave their cells for work or tried to escape the prison altogether. The Kentucky Penitentiary was not the first prison to use inmates for labor, but in previous articulations, companies brought objects to the prison for assembly or rented labor for fixed amounts of time. The model Joel Scott pioneered is the origin of convict leasing, or the idea that an entire prison could be leased out to run as an individual business. Until 1825, the Kentucky Penitentiary was owned by the state, and the keeper was a state official. But Joel Scott managed to persuade the legislature to lease the penitentiary to him for $6,000 plus 6.5% of annual profits. Scott was keeper from 1825 until 1834, when ill health forced him to resign. From a time when keepers made very little money for themselves or the state, Scott raked in more than $1 million in today's terms. He made being keeper a coveted position. There were fierce competition among 5 different candidates to be his successor. Thomas S. Theobald, who landed the job, made more than $6 million in today's money. From running the penitentiary as a business, the Kentucky penitentiary system would eventually hire inmate labor to contractors and deploy them on public works projects, including roads paving the way to territories further west. Meanwhile, the prison committee gloated that Kentucky spent less on her penitentiary than other states and received a great profit. These developments led the editor of the Louisville Courier-Journal to remark that Kentucky was the only state where convicts were sold into absolute slavery. An 1872 report of the commissioners to the Prison Association said the penitentiary appears to have been designed for no other purpose than that of cruel and inhuman punishment, coupled with the destruction and degradation of the moral and intellectual man. Legislators fretted that Kentucky was the only state free from direct responsibility toward its convicted criminals, and especially damning criticism from a state that had initially conceived of itself as a beacon of enlightened criminal jurisprudence. In the decades following emancipation, Kentucky created an additional prison as well as a juvenile reformatory. Later, the state would add asylums to the institutional landscape. In the first decades of the 20th century, these institutions were gathered under first a 5-member state board of control for charitable and penal institutions, and then a board of charities and corrections. By 1932, that board was replaced by a commission of public institutions that was swiftly renamed the Department of Public Welfare. Elizabeth Hinton has written about how Lyndon B. Johnson's Great Society initiatives, which might be seen as an extension of FDR's New Deal legislation, gave rise to a geography for managing marginal low-income populations that did not merely shape the war on poverty, but the war on crime. The story of Kentucky's first penitentiary suggests that the welfare state did not merely morph into a broader apparatus for policing and incarceration, it was born from it. Between 1865 and 1938, Kentucky's prison population increased by more than 1,900%, while the total population of the state only increased by 123%. Thus, in addition to seeing how the welfare state gave rise to the carceral state, we should note that welfare policy was always part of a carceral apparatus. In closing, I would like to suggest that there are 2 reasons why other scholars have overlooked the significance of hemp farming in the Kentucky Penitentiary as what created the institutional infrastructure for convict leasing. The first stems from focusing on broad dynamics in the way that race and capital articulate, and not paying enough attention to the specific forms in which these relationships are inscribed, like Joel Scott's specific contractual arrangement with the Kentucky State Legislature. The other has to do with the fact that Scott leased the prison out, but then renovated it to create industries inside of it, rather than leasing inmates to other companies, as would later be the pattern in the later part of the 19th century for convict leasing projects. Finally, scholars have overlooked this because they have focused on the way that the 13th Amendment creates a legal justification for forcing prison inmates to work for free, and because it was passed in the aftermath of emancipation, and because the overwhelming majority of prison inmates in the decades following emancipation were African American, the assumption is that the practice must have been exclusively designed for that purpose. Convict leasing emerged from a context that enabled slavery to thrive for 50 years following the American Revolution. By the time the U.S. shook its status as a British colony to become a sovereign nation, 500,000 human beings were held in bondage. During the next few decades, slavery would grow in tandem with the United States, spreading west to Kentucky and Missouri, and south to Tennessee, Louisiana, Alabama, and Mississippi. In the process, the number of people held in bondage would triple. That's the final reason scholars have overlooked the Kentucky Penitentiary, because of a lingering supposition that the Deep South was the most violent site of capital exploitation, the North was the most enlightened, and the Middle States were somewhere in the middle. But as this story suggests, some of the most vicious forms of capital exploitation were born from contexts that envisioned themselves as progressive. Convict leasing is not a post-slavery institution or mere extension of the plantation. Instead, it was born from experiments in capitalism and liberal reform set in motion by the War for Independence. It took a textile manufacturer from a slaveholding family to show the nation how much profit could be generated by making coercive labor available to citizens of different races, genders, and sectors of society. Thank you. I apologize, I have bad allergies, so it's a lot of coughing and sneezing. But questions, comments, concerns? Yeah.
Okay, so I have a question. So this is really interesting on how you kind of wove different strands together.
Okay.
And the one link that I didn't catch on to is you describe hemp, well, your sources describe hemp very clearly as kind of a racialized process of production and crop. So it became very well known as kind of a black crop or a crop. And then when it moved into convict leasing and prison production, what was the prison population like, and how did hemp become deraced, if it was, or
Yeah.
how was it then, how were non-black folk able to successfully?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I guess I'll give like the broader implications of the argument than to your specific question, because I guess it's not that I would say it was deracialized, but I think the empirical question is sort of like how did hemp work in relation to race, or how did race labor and expertise conversion this industry? And I guess the way that race works is not like self-evident or something like that. So initially hemp was associated with slavery in Kentucky. Obviously then black people work on hemp and most white people would not do it. Like free white workers would not do it. Then it was brought into the prison, and the prison in Kentucky was mostly white inmates. Increasingly, there were black inmates and there were inmates from areas where hemp was in abundance also. So arguably, they're being some level recruited for their expertise, or those are places being targeted. But excuse me, the penitentiary in Kentucky was always mixed by race and gender, you know? So I think hemp production was always racialized because it sort of began and was mostly concentrated in slavery. But that doesn't mean it was ever exclusively black, or certainly not after it was imported to prison, it wasn't exclusively black, you know? So maybe initially it was almost exclusively black, unless there were like a few white farmers who couldn't afford to hire enslaved people or something like that. But once it's brought into the prison, there are people, both black and white people, working on hemp or something like that. So, I mean, there's another question that I'm not able to answer, but that interests me about like whether white inmates were racialized in a particular way from having worked on hemp in the prison, you know? But I don't exactly know how formerly incarcerated, like white people who had worked on hemp while they're in prison were regarded or something like that. But I think it would have been interesting because, an interesting question because prior to this hemp moment in the prison, as I mentioned, like most people did what they did for a living inside the, like your punishment in the prison was linked to what you did for a living before that. Because the notion was somehow that it's just the context of the prison with its solitude and seclusion that helps rectify the wayward soul. But it was more like you did the task that was most suited to you, so what you'd been doing already was fine for you to do. It was only sort of in the reign of Joel Scott where it became kind of a factory where they're sort of bringing everybody in and they're doing hemp primarily, a few other things as well, but where there's an emphasis to make people do something that's profitable to the prison and allegedly profitable to society.
Yeah. I mean, because it sounds to me that like what seemed to happen is it wasn't just a black crop, but it was a bonded labor crop.
Yeah.
So that it was able to transition into another bonded labor environment.
Right.
With ease.
Right. Although, yes, that's true. Although it's important, I think, that the prison wasn't initially bonded labor. Well, initially the prison was more very casual, you know, until Joel Scott, you know. It was like, a lot of sentences could be like 3 months, 6 months, something like that, you know.
So thinking in relation to 13th, I'm curious if you came across any evidence that black individuals were criminalized for the sake of drawing them into the prison industry. And if so, or if not.
Like even in this earlier period, you mean?
Say that again?
You mean in this earlier period, like Joel Scott's era? Well, from what I understand, I would say that there was an effort to ratchet up incarceration rates in general and extend prison sentences and to compel most inmates to do hemp, but there wasn't the sense of targeting exclusively African Americans as there would be post-emancipation or something like that. And so in terms of my relation to the arguments like 13th and stuff like that, it's not so much that I disagree with them as that I think it's true after emancipation. I just don't think that's where convict leasing started or why it started. You know? I don't think it started then or started for that reason, although I think it took that form after emancipation for some of the reasons they're saying, you know what I mean? But I think it's interesting and important that in Kentucky, debtors were vulnerable, you know, and they almost weren't because they had the upper hand in legislation and they had moral authority in the years following the American Revolution, but they sort of lost the battle to creditors, and then they also kind of lost their leverage in the eyes of the state. Because initially, the state was very sensitive to the plight of debtors, which is what made Kentucky such a haven for debtors, you know? But I think they lost the sort of battle, because by the time the governing nation is recommending longer prison sentences, they're sort of comfortable with the idea that marginal populations can be locked up and made productive. You know, initially, they're almost, state legislatures are all tilting in the other direction. They're sort of saying like, the public is struggling to recover from the American Revolution, so we need policies favorable to debtors so that people can kind of recover or something like that. You know? And I think at least it's important that there is that history of sort of people pressuring legislators and legislators feeling compelled to rectify the plight of debtors or something like that. You know? Particularly in places like Kentucky, which were sort of like new frontiers, you know. Because Kentucky understood itself to be sort of perfecting democracy or something, or perfecting American society. Like Virginia to that point was like the template, and Kentucky understood itself to be a better version of Virginia, which is why they built a prison as soon as they settled, because they thought we'll be more humane, you know, like we won't use capital punishment for all serious crimes. Yeah.
It's kind of related to Amanda's question, but I'm curious if you have a sense of what crimes became kind of the key crimes that were being punished. So I'm thinking of like punishment being a tool to manage the poor, and if that's kind of like vagrancy and those kinds of crimes were what filled the prisons. They weren't kind of completely racialized.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I didn't find, I should go back and look, but I didn't find that there was like a particular emphasis on certain crimes. Like in post-emancipation period, it had to be like vagrancy or loitering, things like that. I didn't find that. I feel like across the board, they were sort of consistently extending sentences for every crime. Certainly the crimes that people were being incarcerated for were like more obvious things like theft and things like that, you know? But I think I'll go back and revisit that. I'm not sure exactly. I think one thing that was interesting too about the morality of debtors, as I mentioned that Kentucky was the first state to abolish debtors' prisons or imprisonment for debt. And they abolished imprisonment for debt unless it was a case of fraud or something like that. So that was interesting too, because it's like if you couldn't pay your debts, but you were an honest person sort of, then you would not be in prison for debt. But like if you were sort of a scandalous business person, you could still be in prison for debt. So that's interesting.
Yeah, thanks for a great talk.
Okay.
Really interesting stuff. I'm wondering if, as you said, this study is not just a kind of prequel to the 13th, but if you're also seeing it as a prequel to work like Naomi Murakawa's The First Civil Right, that kind of argues that liberal attempts to reform the prison are what created mass incarceration, just in terms of Scott's focus on, kind of as you pointed out, kind of liberal ideas of reform and instilling discipline as part of what opened the door to prison labor in this case and the leasing of convicts. And then secondly, I'm just curious if you could go back to where you started the talk and tell us a little bit more about how this work fits into your work on the forensics of capital and the establishment of a forensic profile and a debtor profile. So how are you drawing the connection between those two projects in terms of how you're theorizing this one?
Yeah, thank you. So I'll start with the second question. I guess I was thinking about this. Sometimes, you know, when you have to write, I guess, a summary of your research or you have to write for grants or something, I was thinking about the relationship between these various projects, and one thing that occurred to me was that in the slave insurance project, I'm basically saying that there were a bunch of people who were legally enslaved, but they had these skill sets that were highly valuable in the marketplace, and they had this expertise and even this mobility. So I'm going back to this picture of these, so like, from bakers, butchers, clerks, drivers, engineers, this looks like the U.S. working class or something like that, right? So, and if you, for instance, were an enslaved iron worker, you could sometimes be given cash incentives to produce more things. You could negotiate to have your family live near you. You could even, in the year, like the last decade or two of legalized enslavement, negotiate a time for your manumission or something like that, because they were like making so much money and so their job was so lucrative and they were so skilled, So even though they're technically enslaved, they have a lot more mobility than most enslaved people and almost like some free workers. So they're enslaved but approaching what we think of as like a exploited wage worker. And then in the case of Kentucky, I'm basically saying that even though some of these people were free, their condition was approaching the condition of an enslaved person. So I guess that's one of the arguments, is that particularly in the last few decades of legalized slavery, there was a porous boundary between slavery and freedom, such that you could either be sort of enslaved in approximating freedom or free in approximating slavery. I mean, there's interesting examples of, like, at a coal mine in Virginia, where you could have a coal mine in Virginia, enslaved people and free white workers working side by side. The foreman of the mine is an enslaved person. If the mine blew up, as they often did, they would only, unless there's a case where there's like 35 enslaved people and only 2 free white workers. In the newspaper, they only publish the names of the 2 white workers, because the slaves are property, they don't even matter. They didn't publish their names when the mine blew up. But then usually enslaved mine workers were insured by the owner of the mine in case they died in an accident, and the white workers were not. So in a way, the lives of the enslaved black workers could be more valuable to their boss, even though they're less free in society, So I think there's some interesting contradictions around capitalism and monetary value of someone's life, and also around this question of like what constitutes slavery versus freedom in the last few decades as it's breaking down. But in terms of the first part, yeah, definitely. I'm glad you gave me a chance to kind of elaborate my argument. So I think when people think about convict leasing, I understand why people have focused on, like, let's say Angola and Louisiana, like the state prison, where it's built on the site of a former slave plantation. It has its name Angola because allegedly that's where most of the slaves were from. So when you see a prison built on the site of a former slave plantation, it's easy to see that continuity geographically, ideologically, in terms of the labor structure. Or in Texas, when prison labor looks like plantation system, you see that. And those forms of, those work regimes are very coercive and very violent. But I think it's interesting that Joel Scott's approach was about kind of capitalist innovation. Like, I'll have this lease agreement with the state, and then also introduce this new labor regime into the prison. And Kentucky's prison was built because they wanted to be more free than Virginia, So it's without that liberal progressive reform, without the prison as a substitute for capital punishment, they never would have built the prison as soon as they settled in Kentucky. So between them building the prison and allowing Joel Scott to do this lease agreement is really like the intersection of liberal progress, progressive reform, and capitalist enterprise and innovation that creates convict leasing. And I think but people prefer to think of capitalism in a barbaric way, and because I think the structural violence is harder to notice, maybe, like even there's histories of prisons that don't talk about Kentucky at all, or sort of assume it must have come later. They're looking for prisons in places like Texas, Louisiana, or something like that, like where it must have been most violent and most ruthless. And I guess a good contemporary example of this intersection of capitalist enterprise and progressive reform is like around cash bail. I was telling the graduate students at lunch that, a lot of places where they have introduced because obviously the critique of cash bail is that even if you're innocent, you could be forced to stay in jail if you can't pay your bail until your arraignment. So poor people are being jailed disproportionately. So now part of the progressive reform has said you can have electronic monitoring and be at home instead of being in jail until your arraignment, but they charge you for the cost of electronic monitoring. So basically they're still putting you in debt even though you're innocent, So from a regime of being like confined, now you're in a regime of indebtedness in your own home. And so people then make money who are the wireless plans who do the electronic monitoring. Those companies are making money from keeping innocent people indebted. But it's still progress, so I guess you'd rather be home than be in jail. So I think that idea that it's both profitable and a regime of indebtedness, but also progress, is like kind of how capitalism works, you know? So I think that's, or at least a crucial feature of it, you know? And I think related to this, it's interesting that, you know, even in the history of capitalism or racial capitalism or new history of capitalism, scholars, most of them are really interested in cotton kingdom or something like that, you know? So much so that if I say I work on capitalism and slavery, people say like, oh, you study cotton, where do you work on cotton? Because they haven't studied things like insurance, because it is partly about expertise and mobility, and I think that's harder for them to square with how they think capitalism works. Like, the arguments about cotton and productivity are something like you generate productivity by beating slaves to pick more cotton, and there's like a direct correlation between how much you punish them and how much cotton they pick that generates your profits. But that's the assumption about how capitalism works, that it's like a regime of violence, and that, or sort of like corporeal violence, and that it's proportional to productivity. But capitalism also works with various incentives, strategies for creating mobility, expertise, and monetizing expertise. You know, so there's other kinds of ways that capitalism generates profit that I guess some people have not considered as much because they're not thinking about capitalism in that way or something. You know?
Like you kind of like answered it a little bit in terms of kind of like what do you hope kind of, or like, and I guess the question I likely had was how do you feel kind of like dominant explanations of kind of like the rise of like convict leasing kind of ways to kind of like liberal kind of assertions to get rid of prison, and what do you think is kind of to some degree is kind of like the negative side effects to kind of like dominant stories of justice and that comes out of the plantation as opposed to your intervention that's kind of like saying it's coming out of kind of like capitalist kind of like experimentality that's not necessary per se kind of like relating to the plantation. I guess like what would you say kind of like your like intervention kind of like offers in kind of rebuttal to some of these like very liberal assertions of kind of like where convict leasing comes from? I mean, with the explanation.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, actually, I think this question helps me come back to something that I could develop more from Yusuf's question, because I think, you know, I would say one implication of this research is that while, you know, I guess liberalism is preferable to, I don't know, fascism or something, it's inadequate to deliver social justice, right? So, because part of what liberalism is a kind of developmental horizon that presumes certain people could potentially attain freedom one day, but they have to do more to demonstrate that they're deserving of their freedom, and that other people are the custodians of their progress, and then have to offer sanction about when they've made progress. So, for instance, in former plantation societies, slavery was usually followed by some kind of apprenticeship, right? You know, or you could say the end of colonialism was followed by some kind of implied or stated hierarchy where international governing agencies, international financial agencies supervise the developing countries, right? So a kind of just framework would be that people can be autonomous, right? But there's some kind of developmental horizon against which people are being measured, and that's liberalism, you know? So, and I think there's implications for a lot of things like, you know, even schooling, right? Like certain parts of the country, like who goes to which kind of school and why, under what circumstances. And I guess there are versions of liberalism that can seem or sound like freedom, you know, but often they're still trapped in a kind of developmental horizon. Like I teach at NYU, I live in New York. There are a lot of progressive people there in New York City, but if you try to desegregate their school, they'll fight you in the street, you know? And it doesn't bother them that certain people who are wealthy, their kids go to the best schools and other people's kids go to awful schools. They might attack inequality at a more abstract level, but they're not actually attacking this sort of developmental paradigm that we're all sort of trapped within. So, and so I think in a way, part of why it's important to think through liberalism is because so many versions of it seem really benign, you know? So I guess the last thing I'll give is the life insurance research. So when we think about slave insurance to life insurance is that life insurance doesn't really come about till the 1840s, and that's like, or Americans actually, I should say, don't really aren't enthusiastic about life insurance in large numbers until 1840s, right? Maybe in Britain as late as the late 18th century, early 19th century, people are starting to get life insurance in large numbers, but for Americans, it's both moving to urban contexts, leaving their agrarian communities and networks, like the kind of mutual aid forms they would have relied on, and being alone in the city and wanting to have security for their families, so they finally take life insurance policies. But I also think it's about having trafficked in insurance on enslaved people and seeing how they guarded against the loss, this potential risk, the potential loss of the skill set, and now they're doing that for themselves as well in their jobs. But what life insurance is, in a way, is like privatizing a monetary hierarchy in human life, you know? Like, and so that's interesting that it comes about at like the birth of free society. Like, basically right as slavery's ending, life insurance is becoming more prominent, and now we all have life insurance policies. Most people have life insurance, right? So, but we live in a free society. At least we would say we're free and equal to each other, but to an actuary or underwriter, we're not equal, because, and you know, they base your value of your life on projected future wages, risk factors, histories of illness in your family. So, but these things that are the basis for our life insurance policies are private information, you know? So unlike slavery, where slavery, at least in the slave auction block or something, you could debate and you're aware of the fact that people's lives have different price tags. In a free society, our lives have different price tags. It's private information. It's not even available to us. You could say that life insurance is like the privatization of a calculus that previously governed enslaved people, and it was just kind of democratized and privatized, and that's what insurance is. So I think, you know, it would be interesting to attack that logic, right? Like, what would it mean to actually treat people's lives as being essentially equal materially or something like that, you know? Because it's interesting that we have the kind of lofty political rhetoric of equality, but the material fact of drastic inequality and like sort of how lives are valued, you know?
Yeah, I guess I have two questions. One is about this actuarial logic. And, you know, it strikes me that perhaps, well, the way you just articulated that setup makes me think as a demographer that it makes sense that, you know, all of these inputs to life expectancy and future earnings and so on is how you would value, you know, how much to pay out or compensate one's family or institution, because increasingly employers are given a cut of this money should their employees die, which I don't think a lot of people actually know. And so it makes sense to have that calculus now. But at the time of slavery, a lot of people didn't have a lot of information about the inputs to life expectancy, and more importantly, the people who were in control of the destinies of the people for whom they would be underwritten, the slave owners were really they had the most control over the life expectancies of their quote-unquote property. And so in that sense, this equation is not balanced, right? And so the importation from the past to the present sort of is kind of murky for me. But the second question that I have is mostly about how you imagine this debt that the state has partially or somewhat forgiven in the past. How does that relate to what we're experiencing now around monetary sanctions? You use the example of the ankle bracelet and the person preferring to be at home but under surveillance and having to pay for that. But there's a consequence to that as well. And the consequence is many of those people can't afford to pay those surveillance fees. Right. And the direct result is that many of them have their wages and other financial resources garnished. Their loved ones have routinely go into other forms of debt, largely credit card debt, in order to fund or pay for or pay off the debts of their loved ones who have been incarcerated or are currently incarcerated. And so in that sense, the debt is transferred. But more importantly, the state is no longer in a position to forgive those debts to some degree. For instance, here in California, the Income Franchise Tax Board will totally garnish your check or intercept your tax refunds to apply to any outstanding criminal justice debt. And so I'm wondering, how does this discussion about debt historically, in the case of Kentucky, import to what we see today around the criminal justice system?
Yeah, that's a good question. Let's start with the second question. I mean, I think it's a great question. I think part of what's important is that like who's a debtor and who's a creditor is like a political distinction, you know. And I think that distinction should govern how we think debts are adjudicated, you know. So, for instance, if essentially you could demonstrate, which we could demonstrate statistically, that people of certain racial backgrounds, even people who are gender nonconforming, are disproportionately suffering at the hands of the criminal justice system, because even things like probation are based on like your family network. Do you have a family you can go to, or are you a flight risk, right? So not just race, but even sexuality and stuff like that, sexual orientation is linked to sort of disproportionate treatment in criminal justice. That could be construed as a kind of human rights violation or something like that, you know, in which case the U.S. could or should face sanctions for what it's doing to certain groups of people. That would change the whole narrative about what's happening with subjecting these people further to debt. So I think your question, which is like, how do people fight back against a state that's kind of predatory? I think part of it requires both like a protest movement and also legislation that would sort of reorient the very notion of who's the creditor and who's the debtor. You know, I think as long as you're sort of trapped within that existing framework that essentially certain people are guilty until proven innocent, right, by having to like be subject to electronic monitoring, having their wages garnished, I think it's extractive and predatory precisely for that reason, because they're still innocent. They should not be subject to that. But I think it requires sort of political mobilization, both through policy and also through at a grassroots level, to kind of make the violence of that system clear. But to your first question, actually, I want to clarify something. So I think although slaves are legally property, slave insurers did not suffer from the problem of moral hazard in this way, because the only kinds of slaves who were insured were enslaved people whose skill sets were highly valuable in the marketplace. So in other words, like while slaves are legally property, unlike furniture cannot accrue value over time based on its expertise, but enslaved people can. So like it's interesting because you notice that an enslaved blacksmith who's insured will be worth more money at age 45 than he was at age 35. That's strange, because you think like, oh, his value would depreciate as he gets older, but actually it appreciates because he's more skilled as a blacksmith 10 years later. So I just want to clarify that part of it, you know. Also, I want to say that, like, I guess part of what's important about this is that slave insurance was not actuarial, right? Because as you're suggesting, a lot of companies did not feel like they had good data, but in a way, it just proves, I guess, the value of maybe anthropology as a method or something, as a sort of its skill set, because ethnographically, they do take these policies, you know? So essentially what will happen is someone will say, you know, I know we don't usually do policies on slaves, we don't know the data, but this guy has had these 10 slaves working for a railroad, and this is good money. I think we should let him do some insurance policies on them or something like that. And it would be much more like that. Like they would say, and this is interesting because it means that the marketplace was ahead of the law in realizing the value of the skill set of these enslaved people. Like they were like, oh, there's money to be made here because these enslaved people work in these very lucrative industries. So even before they were recognized as people in the eyes of the law, they were seen as skilled workers in the eyes of the marketplace, you know? So I just want to clarify that.
Any more questions? Getting back to the hemp industry, so what do you see as the cause of the decline of the hemp industry, especially for the convicts and the leasing?
I think a lot of it had to do with the fact that there were like other substitutes for hemp later, you know. So in Kentucky, hemp took the place of cotton because they couldn't have cotton, they couldn't have plantations. The agriculture was not suited for it. But by the 1860s, when this warden was writing to the governor, he's basically saying like, hemp is not as profitable, so I don't want to devote so much of the prison labor structure to it, you know. So, but I'm glad you asked that because it does remind me to say something else that I think is important for this research. So, so it's interesting when you look at crime statistics, right? Sometimes amongst, like, say, white people, Appalachian whites are disproportionately policed and surveilled and incarcerated, right? And it's almost like Appalachian whites stand up for racial minorities in the absence of racial minorities or something like that, or most white people, Appalachian whites. And so this is a story about like people who moved west from Virginia. So this is really a story about Appalachian whites, and I think it's interesting when we hear these narratives about people who like suffered these historic injustices. In a way, when they say that, right, they feel like they've been exploited and no one's paying attention to their plight. They're right in a sense, you know. Like I actually think of the descendants of the people who were incarcerated in this prison as the people who helped elect Trump or something like that. You know, like I think it's like white people in the Rust Belt who feel historically exploited and overlooked. And I think that's like empirically it's sound. The problem is with who they decide is responsible for that. You know, but it is true that these white people in the Rust Belt have been historically exploited, you know, over generations or something like that, you know, because this is essentially like the same region. It's the same demographic that essentially still is like poorly educated and like low income white populations.
Thank you so much for your talk. I really liked how you talked about the importance of thinking carefully about how race, labor, and capital converge and come together, and you sort of showed that through the evidence. So of course I wanted to ask you about this larger thematic of racial capitalism and how it's circulating in the academy. And I also was curious if you had thoughts about the kind of ways in which racial capitalism is being applied in the university context to talk about student debt relations and the extraction of questions of race and diversity in the university. And if you've been thinking across the intellectual work that you're doing and then like the labor of the university in the context of capitalism.
I think it's a good question. Actually, I just wrote an article entitled "Racial Capitalism" about racial capitalism. Just came out a few weeks ago, but I'll send it to you. But I think I'm less familiar with, I think, the university context you're mentioning, so I'm not going to have as much to say about that, although I think it's interesting and definitely a lot of faculty of color talk about and experience having to do multiple kinds of work that are not compensated or even acknowledged, you know, because they may have students of color at the universities who see them as providing emotional support and things like that. So it sounds like, is that what you're getting at, maybe? So I think that's important, very important to take seriously, and like ideally to recognize, and credit people for. But racial capitalism as an analytic, you know, I think it's interesting that there are several versions of a kind of renewed interest in capitalism. So one is like, sometimes we call it like the new history of capitalism or something like that. That lingo comes up a lot in among U.S. historians, partly to suggest that there's a new generation of U.S. historians who sort of return to the importance of slavery in the history of capitalism, whereas before there are various versions of the argument that slavery predates capitalism or is not quite capitalism or something like that. Then there's like capitalism and slavery, various iterations of that, and then racial capitalism. I guess a lot of the, you know, although the term racial capitalism apparently was first used by South African scholars and in South African activist context, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, Yusuf, but most people who use the term now sort of take it from Cedric Robinson in his book Black Marxism, where he sort of talks about racial capitalism. And I think one thing I've noticed is that it's used inconsistently, the term. So some people use it to say you shouldn't theorize capitalism without attention to race. Some people use it to say that capitalism always involves some form of racial exploitation. Some people are saying not all forms of capitalism involve racial exploitation, but these forms do, you know? But they will all use racial capitalism, right? So they're actually using it in different ways, but all using it. The other thing that's interesting is that in the way people use racial capitalism, they often refer to, you know, some of the same people that Cedric Robinson refers to as architects of the Black radical tradition, like W.E.B. Du Bois, C.L.R. James. But those scholars talked about race and capitalism, but they didn't use racial capitalism. So then it begs the question, like, why, even if they're talking about race and capitalism, why weren't they using racial capitalism, you know? So it just is an interesting question. I mean, I've yet to see a persuasive articulation of racial capitalism as an analytic, you know? I understand why people use it, but often I think it has effects other than what is intended. So I've seen situations where an African-American faculty member in a history department gave a talk on racial capitalism, and the colleagues like the talk and like the work, but they don't use the concept, racial capitalism. But some of them work on slavery as well. And he doesn't work on slavery, he works on like 20th century history, but he will use racial capitalism, but they don't use it. So then I'm like, well, are only black scholars supposed to use racial capitalism? Or black scholars and their allies, people of color? And then what? Because I can imagine academic jobs being posted, and like there's one on racial capitalism, maybe they expect to hire a person of color or something like that. But then there would be other ones on the history of capitalism or new history of capitalism where they would expect to hire just like a prominent white person. And I guarantee you the new history of capitalism job will pay more than the racial capitalism one. So I'm not sure what's being inscribed. I'm not sure what's being inscribed, you know? So I just felt, look, if it's a term that's useful analytically, why isn't everyone using it, you know? Like, and if it's not, why is anyone using it? I don't know. I need to know more about what's at stake.
We'll probably have to come to a close, but if everybody would like to join me in thanking
Thank you.